Hello, I am Lee Sammons, UT Extension Agent in Hardeman County. Today I'd like to talk to you about the home greenhouse. Greenhouses are structures that alter the environment around crops and provide conditions that optimize plant growth and quality, covered with some type of transparent material, either plastic or glass. There's several reasons you might want to build a greenhouses. One may be to extend my growing season, having vegetables past frost time or before beginning of springtime. You may have carried some cold season crops over into the springtime and harvest during the winter. Another reason may be for starting seedlings. Sometimes varieties of plants that you like to grow are not available in the trade in farm supply stores. So you might want to start some of those seedlings yourself and have them a little bit earlier than plants are available in the farmers supply stores. Other reason might be to propagate your own plants. You may want to take cuttings from a plant from a friend and have a way that you can root it very easily, or you may want to propagate and share some of your plants with others. Or you may have a houseplant collection like orchids or some of the other exotic plants that you want to maintain for your own personal enjoyment. And that's one of the reasons many people build a greenhouse, is just their own personal enjoyment. They enjoy growing plants and seeing things grow. You can extend your gardening season in several ways without building a greenhouse. And we're going to talk a little bit about those before we get started talking about the greenhouse. Some of those might be your row covers, might be cold frames, or it might be a high tunnel like this shown in the picture to the right. Our commercial vegetable growers who are growing for farmers markets, so many of them have started growing in what we call a high tunnel, which they're growing in the ground inside a plastic covered frame that has no heating or ventilation other than the passive heating and cooling that we get from just the sunlight heating up the greenhouse, or the passive ventilation of like having the doors open at the very back or the sides rolled up, where when it gets too hot in the greenhouse, they can open up those areas and you'll get passive air movement that cools the greenhouse, the high tunnel down. You can use row covers, which where you're using a transparent or semi-transparent material that may be flexible, maybe a fabric or could be plastic sheeting, used as a protective cover to shield the plants from wind or the frost or cold temperature, or even insect damage. Many times we'll have insects that attack our early season sets we put out in our garden, and that's one way that you can protect them from some insects. A lot of times we'll have damage to the plants because the cold wind causes a drying out of the plants and does damage in the early season. So you could use some type of row cover protection over the plants to just advance the early start of the plants themselves. Other season extenders would be like the cold frame you see in the picture here to the left, where they've used glass windows and built a cold frame using those. Now, keep in mind when you have a cold frame or any type of small structure that it will heat up very quickly from the solar energy. So you're going to have some way you can manually ventilate that, or some way that you can do it through some type of thermostat control or something that way. Usually on a cold frame, it's kind of done manually to cool the frame down where it's not too hot on the plants. The other is a high tunnel, like we talked about with the other picture. Here you grow in the ground. It's just strictly a plastic cover frame using no heat from heaters or energy source, and no type of electric ventilation and things, just strictly a tunnel that you grow the plants in. The things you may want to consider before you start to build a greenhouse, and that is setting the goal that you want to accomplish with your greenhouse. Do you want this greenhouse to be one where you can grow plants year round? If so, then that's some consideration, equipment and things you may need. Is this just a very small house that you're going to start your transplants in, and then you shut it down in 1st of May because you've already set out your transplants? Or are you going to use it year round for certain plants that you want to keep and maintain? In planning your greenhouse, you want to consider what could be the future use of this greenhouse. Will we be using it to store things in? It should add value to your property. You don't want it to be a distraction on your property. The other thing to consider would be site selection, greenhouse design, the construction materials you may use, and the equipment that you may need for the greenhouse. Now, when you consider the greenhouse site, if you live in a subdivision, you may want to check with your neighborhood, make sure that you're not doing any code violation when you build a greenhouse on your property. You want the building site to be level as possible. That may be a problem depending upon your lot size and site and the grade and those things that way. So keep in mind you should want to build on a level site. Also, you want to consider having easy access to the utilities such as water, which you'll need in the greenhouse, electricity if you're going to be using some type of heating and fan cooling in the greenhouse. Also, you're going to have some source of gas, either natural or propane. So if those things are not accessible to where you want to build a greenhouse, you have to keep in mind that you will need those things. So consider that when you look at the site. The other thing is, do I have plenty of sun at my location where I want to build a greenhouse? You want to avoid shading from trees or from structures. As a rule of thumb, we put our greenhouse 2.5 times the height of something that may cast a shade under the greenhouse that far away from the greenhouse construction site. Avoid the shading of the trees if you're going to be doing a year-round. Plants are being grown in there. If it's deciduous trees and you're just going to use the greenhouse in the springtime for January through 1st of May, you may get by with having some shade because those trees will be not shading because they have no leaf coverage at that time. Also consider directional orientation. Many times your lot may be restricted and you can't consider that, but we like to build the greenhouses in north-south orientation if there's a choice. That way you don't have shadows that stay permanently in the greenhouse itself. So that is one consideration. If that is not an option, you may want to think in terms of when your major directional wind comes from, so you can place your fans where they'll be in tandem with the wind direction rather than blowing against strong wind in your construction site. The types of greenhouse that you may build, there are a couple that you can do. One being the lean-to type. This is where we will build on the side of like a garage, or maybe you have another storage building or something on your property, and you will build a lean-to against that. So you're actually just building 3 sides and a roof onto the greenhouse. It may be cheaper for us construction-wise, it reduces the cost. A lot of times you have electricity or gas out to the shop or something that way, so you have easier access to your utilities. But the trade-off is you're going to have less light shining into the greenhouse because you're probably going to get some shading from the building itself. You want to build on the south or the eastern direction of the building if that's possible. Other type that you can build, and you can use all of these in some type of kit, would be an A-frame type structure. You're getting light all around on four sides of this. You may want to have some type of passive ventilation if you're not going to be using heating. You notice in the roof of this, there are vents that can be opened up and we can let the heat out. This heat's going to rise, so that would be one way of cooling the house down, is opening those vents up, and you get passive air movement outside of the greenhouse to cool it down. Another type of greenhouse that you can build would be a Quonset type of structure. This provides more light because you've got all four sides with light exposure. It does require more heat at night because of the cooling down that occurs. You also have to have some type of ventilation from electrical fans because it will heat up really quick when the temperature rises. So keep those things in mind. It can be made large or small. Usually these type of structures are less expensive than they are glass structure. So we're seeing more of the Quonset type being built, especially where a larger greenhouse may be built in size. So what size do I really need to build this greenhouse? And that goes back and depends upon your goal and needs. If you're wanting to grow your own vegetables year-round, then you may need a larger greenhouse area to provide more space. Remember, the smaller it is, the quicker it heats up, and you don't have to have some type of venting or automatic heating in there. So a minimum space would be 100 square foot if you're going to be using some type of heating or cooling, just from the efficiency standpoint. That would be a 10 by 10 square. So that's going to heat up really fast. You're going to have some way for that to automatically vent to let that hot air out. And also it's going to cool down quickly, so you're doing some way to heat it. The smaller greenhouses, usually 70 to 80% of that square footage is only available for growing plants. The rest of it would be aisles and walkways. So keep that in mind. You would only have, like on 100 square foot, you'd only have about 70 feet of actual growing space in that greenhouse. The size of is directly related to the speed and heat loss and gain in a greenhouse. So also keep that in mind. What do you plan to grow? Well, if you're going to grow flats of plants like your seedlings and transplants, a normal tray that we grow plants in is like a 10 by 20. So you can kind of figure how much space or how many flats of things you could grow. If you've got them in 6-inch pots, that requires about 1 square foot per plant to allow for light and ventilation to occur around the plant, so that you don't get into a disease problem because the plants are too close and you've got less drying out of the foliage when you water, and you can have more disease problems. So keep that in mind as far as how much space and how big of a size and how many plants you're wanting. I never hear people say, well, I built my greenhouse too big. So usually think in terms of how big a greenhouse you need and probably increase it 25, 50%, especially if you're a plant collector, because you're going to run out of space quick because you've got a greenhouse, so you're going to collect more plants every year. So think in terms in your planning, what is my goal and how big of a greenhouse do I need to have? Now the structure, the framing can be made out of wood or steel. You can buy kits of either, or you can get blueprints and build your own out of a wood frame structure. Just keep in mind that commercial houses are designed for wind and snow load, and that is included in the size of the steel pipes. That way, if you're building your own, remember that you construct it strong enough that the snow or the wind won't collapse your greenhouse, especially if you've already got all these plants in there and you'll end up losing everything. Now the floor of the greenhouse, we usually put gravel or concrete especially in the walkways anyway. That helps to keep it a drier area for you to walk in. If it's just plain soil in the greenhouse, you're going to have more of a tendency to have a grass problem growing up in that soil, and if you have gravel or concrete. And the covering material that we use and see more commonly now is some type of polyethylene plastic. This came about in the 1950s when plastic became more common and better plastic was being made over time. So we see less and less glass being used in the construction of the greenhouse themselves. The plastic polyethylene is used a shorter lifespan. You can buy what we call a 6 mil plastic, which gives you about 4 to 5 years of covering on that structure. Or you can buy polycarbonate, which is more expensive and you have a longer lifespan on the skin of the greenhouse itself. Polyethylene, the light transmission will decline every year from year one. So keep that in mind. You can use what we do is a double wall, put 2 sheets of plastic, reinflate that plastic with a blower between the 2 pieces of plastic, and that gives us about a 25% savings in our heating costs because of insulation value of that air between the 2 layers of plastic. The plastic polyethylene also gives you ability to cover it more securely, not have as many air holes like you would with other type of material, glass or something. You do have the cost of the purchase and installation and maintenance. Every 4 or 5 years, you're going to have to replace that polyethylene if it's a 6 mil plastic. And so you do have that cost and you do have the labor. Or if you use a polycarbonate, that is more of a permanent, up to 20 or 25 years protection on it. So you don't have the maintenance problem every 6 years. So it depends upon your needs and what you want to buy in the greenhouse. If the greenhouse structure shown at the right is more of a cold frame than it is an actual greenhouse because there is no heating in that. But what I did want to show you is the side vents about 4 feet up. That can be raised or lowered to provide passive air movement through the greenhouse to help cool that down. So the plastic gives you a little bit more flexibility as far as the covering and ease of covering. Now the environmental controls, you're going to have some type of heating if you're going to operate year round. If you notice all the way to the back, they've got a unit here that's hung up into the ceiling of the greenhouse. They usually are hung rather than sitting on the floor just to give you better heating over the greenhouse. If you notice the fan in the front is what we call a F fan. And what it does is it runs continuously. It gives you even temperature across the greenhouse because it's constantly circulating the air in the greenhouse. It also provides cooling from the standpoint of moving the air in the greenhouse. The cooling that you see in the right side, there is a vent up at the eave with just a shutter on the picture you see in front of you. And all the way to the back of the other end of the greenhouse, there's a shutter with a fan. So the thermostat comes on, calls for cooling. That fan blows the air out. The cool air is pulled in from the other end. And so you have air movement that's pushing and pulling that heated air out of the greenhouse in an exhaust situation. Some of the larger greenhouses, they have these mounted on each side of the door, about 2 feet above ground. And you have vents the same way that is letting fresh air into the greenhouse to help cool the greenhouse down. You're going to need some type of environmental control. Usually single stage thermostats are used for this, one for the heater, one for the fans, to keep it at the temperature that you want in the greenhouse. Now, keep in mind if it's really hot and you have a year-round operation, you may want to go to some type of evaporative cooling where you have water on the end and the air is pulled through those mats to evaporate moisture, help cool it down. Because when it's 85 degrees outside, you're not going to be able to cool it down below 85 degrees or 95 degrees just from fans running. It does make it cooler with air moving through the greenhouse. Another way that you can help keep the heat buildup from occurring quite as much is using some type of shade cover. And that's usually a black web fabric that will reduce. You can select different percentage of shade, either a 35 or 40 or 50 or 65% shade cover, and that reduces the sun from shining in, solar buildup. But it also reduces your light quality in the greenhouse. So if you have some plants, they may stretch a little bit more because they're not getting as much light as they need. The other type of environmental control would be a sidewall venting, that you can let the sidewalls down or roll it up, and that lets air into the greenhouse to help cool it down. If you'd like more information on a small greenhouse, what it can do for you, UT Extension has publication W935A. There's a screenshot there of it. You can find that available at utextension.edu to find out more information. If you have any questions, I am Lee Sammons at UT Hardin County Extension. There's my telephone number. We're glad to answer email or call. So I appreciate you listening today. Hope you have enjoyment in building a greenhouse. Thank you.